The destroyers cut engines 2 miles offshore, gliding through black water toward Taivu Point, with only momentum and the equatorial current pushing them forward. No lights, no radio transmissions. Absolute silence, except for the rhythmic slap of waves against steel hulls. It was 02:30 hours, August 19th, 1942, and Colonel Kiyoano Ichiki's advance detachment was executing what Japanese doctrine called a Yugeki Joriku, a silent night landing designed to achieve complete tactical surprise. On the foredeck of the destroyer Hagikaze, Captain Takeo Nakamura watched his men prepare for disembarkation with mechanical precision. Every soldier knew his role. Every piece of equipment had been secured, checked, rechecked. These were not green conscripts. They were veterans of Manchuria and Shanghai. Men who had perfected amphibious operations on the Yangtze River and night infiltration through enemy territory in northern China. Their Type 38 rifles were spotless despite the salt spray. Their bayonets gleamed even in starlight. Each man carried 120 rounds of ammunition, 3 days of rice, grenades, and unwavering confidence in Japanese infantry superiority. The landing boats scraped onto coral sand without incident. No American patrol boats, no searchlights, no gunfire. 917 soldiers moved inland in disciplined columns, disappearing into the jungle within minutes. The destroyers reversed course immediately. Vanishing into darkness before dawn could expose them to Henderson Field's aircraft. The operation had proceeded flawlessly, exactly as rehearsed at Truk, exactly as doctrine prescribed. Colonel Ichiki established his command post beneath a grove of coconut palms 300 meters inland. His staff officers spread topographical maps across folded ponchos, marking the American perimeter 15 miles westward. Intelligence summaries painted an encouraging picture. Marine strength estimated at 2,000 men, possibly fewer after disease and malnutrition took their toll. Naval forces had abandoned them after Savo Island. Supply situation critical. Morale reportedly low. Henderson Field's defenses consisted of hastily dug fighting positions and minimal fortification. Nothing that could withstand a determined night assault by disciplined infantry. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Ichiki's orders from 17th Army Headquarters at Rabaul had been explicit. Wait for the remaining battalions before attacking. But Ichiki studied the maps and saw opportunity, not obstacles. Every hour's delay gave Americans time to strengthen defenses, bring in reinforcements, stockpile ammunition. Speed was the samurai virtue. Audacity won battles. His men had trained for exactly this scenario: night infiltration, rapid assault, overwhelming the enemy before they could organize coordinated resistance. "We advance at nightfall tomorrow," Ichiki told his assembled company commanders. "Direct approach along the coastal track. Strike Henderson Field before midnight. The Americans will panic when they hear our battle cries in the darkness. They always do." Captain Nakamura recorded the orders in his journal without comment. Around him, soldiers sharpened bayonets, cleaned rifle bolts, and whispered confidently about the swift victory ahead. None questioned their commander's decision. None imagined that within 48 hours, fewer than 100 would still be alive. The jungle pressed in from all sides, humid and suffocating. Somewhere to the west, American Marines were waiting. The coastal track that looked passable on Japanese maps dissolved into a nightmare of roots, vines, and sucking mud within the first mile. What intelligence had described as light jungle terrain, suitable for rapid infantry movement, proved to be nearly impenetrable vegetation that reduced Ichiki's advance to a crawl. Soldiers hacked through walls of wait-a-while vines that tore uniforms and flesh alike. The heat was suffocating. 120 degrees beneath the canopy, humidity approaching saturation. Men drank their canteens dry within hours, then drank from streams that would later incapacitate half the detachment with dysentery. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Unit cohesion fractured as companies became separated by terrain. Radio communication failed in the dense foliage. Officers resorted to runners who frequently got lost in the labyrinth of identical-looking jungle. The advance that Ichiki had planned to complete in 6 hours stretched into a full day, then 2. Every step revealed how catastrophically Japanese intelligence had failed to assess Guadalcanal's environment. 15 miles westward, the Marines were transforming that same jungle into a weapon system. General Vandergrift had positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the western bank of the Ilu River's sandbar approach, the most obvious avenue for any eastern assault on Henderson Field. But these weren't hasty fighting positions dug in panic. Combat engineers had spent 3 days creating interlocking fields of fire with mathematical precision. Browning M1917A1 water-cooled machine guns were positioned so that every square meter of the sandbar fell under overlapping fire from at least 2 weapons. Mortars were pre-registered on approach routes. Artillery forward observers had mapped coordinates for every piece of terrain within 1,000 meters. The Marines cleared fields of fire, dug protective berms, stockpiled ammunition in protected positions. They strung communication wire, connecting every fighting position to battalion headquarters. They rehearsed fire discipline, coordinated responses, and casualty evacuation procedures. When the Japanese finally emerged from the jungle, exhausted and disoriented, they would be entering a killing zone designed with industrial precision. Just after midnight on August 21st, Solomon Islands scout Jacob Vusa stumbled into Marine lines with a desperate warning. The Japanese were coming, hundreds of them, moving through the jungle toward the sandbar. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the open sandbar, screaming "Banzai!", firing rifles, hurling grenades. They ran in disciplined waves, bayonets fixed, convinced that shock and fighting spirit would shatter American defenses. Colonel Ichiki had positioned his entire force for a frontal assault, the textbook Japanese infantry doctrine that had worked in China, in the Philippines, across every battlefield since 1937. The Browning M1917A1 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. These water-cooled weapons, perfected during World War I, were designed for sustained fire, 600 rounds per minute, indefinitely, as long as the water jackets stayed filled and ammunition belts kept feeding. The Marines had positioned 6 guns in mutually supporting positions so that no area of the sandbar remained uncovered. The interlocking fields of fire created a mathematical certainty. Every soldier crossing that killing zone would pass through multiple cone-shaped zones of destruction. Japanese soldiers fell in waves. Those who survived the machine gun fire ran directly into 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, giant shotgun shells that transformed men into shredded meat at 50 meters. Mortars rained from above with unerring precision, their crews working from pre-registered coordinates. The attack continued for 6 hours. Wave after wave charged into the machine gun fire. Some Japanese soldiers reached Marine positions and engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat, bayonets against rifle butts, knives against entrenching tools. But the defensive system held. The interlocking fire prevented any breakthrough. Dawn revealed the catastrophe. The sandbar was carpeted with bodies, over 800 Japanese soldiers dead or dying. General Vandergrift ordered M3 Stuart light tanks forward. They crossed the sandbar and systematically hunted survivors through coconut groves, their canister shells flushing out and destroying scattered groups. By noon, Ichiki's detachment had ceased to exist. Marine casualties, 44 killed and wounded. The jungle had become America's weapon. The Tanaru slaughter wasn't luck or superior courage. It was the result of a defensive system designed through methodical intelligence analysis and coordinated firepower doctrine that Japanese forces had never encountered. Captain Charles Brush's patrol on August 19th had provided the critical intelligence: Japanese strength, direction of approach, timing of attack. But it was what General Vandergrift and his officers did with that intelligence that revealed the fundamental difference between American and Japanese warfare philosophy. While Japanese doctrine emphasized saishin, fighting spirit, as the decisive factor, American doctrine treated combat as an engineering problem requiring systematic solutions. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, commanding the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, had spent the days following Brush's contact wargaming every possible Japanese approach. He understood that Japanese infantry doctrine favored night attacks and frontal assaults, tactics designed to negate American firepower advantages through shock and close combat. The American response was to create defensive positions where firepower couldn't be negated, regardless of darkness or proximity. The machine gun positions along the Ilu weren't randomly placed. Combat engineers calculated exact fields of fire, ensuring overlapping coverage with no dead space. Each gun crew had backup positions pre-prepared. Ammunition was stockpiled in protected berms. Communication wire connected every position to battalion headquarters, allowing real-time coordination. Forward observers for 75mm pack howitzers and 105mm artillery had pre-registered coordinates for every approach route. When Japanese soldiers charged, they weren't fighting individual Marines. They were fighting an integrated system where machine guns, mortars, artillery, and even offshore naval guns from the destroyer USS Monson worked in coordinated symphony. Radio operators called fire missions. Artillery crews responded within seconds. Mortars dropped rounds with pre-calculated accuracy. The Japanese attacked with courage. The Americans responded with mathematics. Every wave that charged across that sandbar entered a killing zone where survival was statistically impossible. The jungle's dense vegetation that had slowed Japanese advance now channeled them into predetermined fire lanes, transforming terrain into a tactical advantage. Industrial warfare had arrived in the Pacific. Henderson Field became the beating heart of American power in the Solomons, and the Japanese High Command's obsession. The airstrip that construction workers had abandoned on August 7th now hosted Marine Air Group 23's Wildcat fighters and Dauntless dive bombers, collectively known as the Cactus Air Force, after Guadalcanal's operational codename. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the seas for 200 miles in every direction during daylight hours. Japanese ships attempting daytime runs faced certain destruction from American aircraft. The result was a bizarre temporal division of the battlefield. Japan owned the night, America owned the day. The Tokyo Express, as Marines dubbed it, or Rat Run in less charitable moments, became Japan's lifeline. Fast destroyers racing down the slot between the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies, then racing back before dawn, exposed them to Henderson's aircraft. Vice Admiral Raizo Tanaka perfected these high-speed nocturnal insertions, delivering thousands of reinforcements over the coming months. But night supply runs could never match the systematic logistics flowing into Henderson during daylight. American cargo ships unloaded supplies openly. Engineers extended the runway, built revetments, constructed fuel depots. Medical stations, ammunition dumps, and command facilities transformed the perimeter into a fortified position. The Seabees, naval construction battalions, worked with industrial efficiency that Japanese forces couldn't comprehend, let alone match. Every dawn, wildcats lifted off to patrol the slot. Every afternoon, dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions across the island. The Cactus Air Force operated with mechanical regularity, despite constant Japanese artillery harassment and nightly bombing runs by Washing Machine Charlie, the lone Japanese floatplane that droned overhead, disrupting sleep but causing minimal damage. Henderson Field wasn't just an airstrip. It was the manifestation of American industrial capacity, projecting power across the Pacific. The Japanese could reinforce at night, but they couldn't build, couldn't resupply at scale, couldn't establish the systematic logistics that modern warfare demanded. The airfield had become America's unsinkable aircraft carrier, and it was strangling Japanese operations throughout the Solomons. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived with 6,000 men and a plan to succeed where Ichiki had failed. No frontal assaults across open ground. Instead, a sophisticated night attack through jungle approaches directly at Henderson Field's southern perimeter, a coral ridge held by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's undermanned battalion. The Japanese attacked on the night of September 12th with everything they had learned. Infiltration tactics, coordinated artillery support, multiple assault columns designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers and simultaneous pressure. They ran into the same industrial killing system that had destroyed Ichiki. Edson had spent days preparing the ridge exactly as doctrine prescribed. Machine gun positions interlocking, mortars pre-registered. Artillery forward observers connected by field telephone to every gun within range. The 11th Marines 100mm howitzers were dialed in with surgical precision. Even naval guns from offshore destroyers stood ready to deliver fire support within minutes of radio calls. The first night's assault nearly broke through. Japanese soldiers fought with suicidal courage, charging into machine gun fire repeatedly, some reaching Marine positions for hand-to-hand combat. Sergeant John Basilone's machine gun section became legendary, 2 guns firing continuously for hours, Basilone racing through enemy fire to retrieve ammunition when supplies ran low, maintaining disciplined fire even as Japanese soldiers died within arm's reach. But courage couldn't overcome coordination. Every Japanese breakthrough met immediate counterfire from supporting positions. Mortars dropped with mathematical precision. Artillery created curtains of high-explosive steel that shredded assault formations. The ridge held. The attacks continued for 3 nights, wave after wave. Banzai charges, infiltration attempts, coordinated assaults, each met with systematic destruction. By September 14th, Kawaguchi's force had suffered 850 killed, roughly 14% casualties, against approximately 104 Marines killed and 278 wounded. The lesson from Tenaru repeated itself. Japanese tactical doctrine, perfected against Chinese and colonial forces, was catastrophically obsolete against American defensive systems designed for industrial-scale warfare. Bloody Ridge proved that Tenaru wasn't an anomaly. It was the new reality. The jungle killed more Japanese soldiers than American bullets ever could. By October 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal numbered over 20,000 men on paper, but fewer than 7,000 remained combat effective. The rest were incapacitated by starvation, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and tropical ulcers that turned minor cuts into gangrenous wounds. Japanese soldiers called Guadalcanal Gato, Starvation Island, a name that revealed the campaign's true nature more accurately than any tactical map. The Tokyo Express delivered troops efficiently, but couldn't sustain them. Fast destroyer runs prioritized soldiers and ammunition over the tons of rice, medical supplies, and equipment necessary to keep an army functional in equatorial jungle. Japanese logistics operated on the assumption that soldiers could live off the land, supplementing meager rations with captured supplies and local resources. But Guadalcanal's jungle provided nothing edible, and American supplies remained securely within defended perimeters. Captured Japanese diaries painted a portrait of systematic collapse. Soldiers described eating tree bark, roots, grass. Daily rice rations dropped from 800 grams to 200, then to nothing. Men too weak to walk were abandoned. Disease spread unchecked through units lacking quinine, antibiotics, or basic medical care. Officers recorded entire companies rendered combat ineffective, not through battle, but through malnutrition and illness. Meanwhile, American forces operated with industrial-scale logistics that Japanese commanders couldn't comprehend. Daily supply runs during Henderson Field's operational hours delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. Cargo ships unloaded openly at Lunga Point. The Navy's construction battalions, Seabees, built roads, warehouses, field hospitals, and sanitation systems. Medical stations treated malaria with quinine, infections with sulfur drugs, wounded with whole blood plasma flown in from rear areas. Marine casualties from disease remained significant. Malaria affected nearly everyone, but American soldiers stayed fed, medicated, and combat effective. Japanese soldiers starved to death in foxholes within sight of Henderson Field. Logistics, not tactics, was determining the campaign's outcome. Industrial capacity was proving more decisive than fighting spirit. The seas around Guadalcanal became a graveyard where Japanese naval superiority collided with American air power and shattered. Between August and November 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal witnessed some of the most brutal naval engagements in history. The Eastern Solomons in August, Cape Esperance in October, the Santa Cruz Islands, and finally, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November. 2 nights of point-blank gunfire that turned Iron Bottom Sound into a ship cemetery. Both sides lost carriers, cruisers, destroyers. Both sides demonstrated exceptional tactical courage and seamanship. But one critical asymmetry determined every engagement's strategic outcome: Henderson Field. Japanese naval forces could win tactical victories, and did repeatedly, in night surface actions, where their superior optics and torpedo doctrine gave them devastating advantages. But every dawn brought American aircraft from Henderson, and daylight belonged to the Cactus Air Force absolutely. Japanese task forces that lingered after sunrise faced systematic destruction from dive bombers and torpedo planes. The pattern repeated with lethal consistency. Japanese destroyers racing down the slot at night, delivering troops and supplies. American reconnaissance aircraft spotting them at first light. Wildcat fighters establishing air superiority. Dauntless dive bombers striking with 1,000-pound bombs. Avenger torpedo bombers finishing crippled vessels. On November 14-15, 1942, the strategic mathematics became undeniable. A Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Guadalcanal with 11 transports carrying 10,000 troops and critical supplies was systematically destroyed. Henderson's aircraft sank 7 transports outright. The remaining 4 beached themselves, disgorging troops and equipment, then were obliterated by continued airstrikes and naval gunfire. Only 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers reached Japanese lines, most without weapons or supplies. Japan's navy could contest the waters at night, but Henderson Field rendered daylight operations suicidal, and modern war required sustained logistics that couldn't survive only in darkness. Air supremacy from a single contested airstrip was strangling Japanese operations throughout the Solomons. The carrier battles at Midway had been decisive, but Henderson Field was proving that land-based air power controlled seas more effectively than fleets. By January 1943, the strategic equation had reversed completely. The Americans, who had been isolated and outnumbered in August, now commanded overwhelming superiority in every dimension of warfare. The question was no longer whether Japan could retake Henderson Field. It was whether any Japanese soldier would escape Guadalcanal alive. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, which had relieved the exhausted 1st Marine Division in December, launched the final offensive on January 10th, with forces the Japanese couldn't hope to match. 2 full Army divisions, the 25th Infantry and Americal Division, backed by Marine units, advancing with the systematic coordination that had characterized American operations since Tenaru. But this time, the Americans weren't defending prepared positions. They were attacking through jungle with the same integrated firepower doctrine that had destroyed Japanese assaults. Artillery barrages preceded every advance. 105 mm and 150 mm howitzers pounding suspected Japanese positions with thousands of rounds. Forward observers called fire missions continuously, adjusting based on enemy response. When infantry encountered resistance, they didn't charge. They pulled back and radioed coordinates. Minutes later, high explosive shells obliterated the position. Henderson Field's aircraft provided close air support with devastating precision. Dauntless dive bombers struck pillboxes and trench systems. Fighters strafed retreating columns. The coordination between ground forces and air power had become seamless through months of shared combat. Offshore, Navy destroyers and cruisers delivered naval gunfire on Japanese positions, identified by spotter planes. Battleship guns, when available, demolished fortified positions from beyond visual range. The Japanese defenders, starved, diseased, down to final ammunition reserves, fought with desperate courage. But courage without logistics, without air support, without artillery, without reinforcement, meant only that death came more slowly. The American advance was methodical, relentless, and utterly industrial. Artillery, air power, and naval guns systematically eliminated resistance. Japanese soldiers who had arrived expecting swift victory now faced systematic annihilation. By late January, organized Japanese resistance collapsed completely. What remained was evacuation or death. Operation K, the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal, represented the Imperial Navy's finest hour and its most devastating admission of defeat. Over 3 nights in early February 1943, destroyers executed a brilliantly coordinated withdrawal, evacuating 10,152 soldiers from Cape Esperance under cover of darkness. The Tokyo Express, which had spent 6 months delivering reinforcements, now ran in reverse, extracting the survivors of Japan's first major land defeat. The soldiers who stumbled aboard those destroyers bore little resemblance to the confident troops who had landed months earlier. Emaciated, disease-ravaged, many weighing less than 90 pounds, they represented a fraction of the forces Japan had committed. Approximately 31,000 Japanese soldiers had deployed to Guadalcanal across the campaign. Roughly 25,000 were dead, 2/3 from starvation and disease rather than combat. The psychological impact transcended casualty statistics. Japanese officers who had studied infantry doctrine at the finest military academies confronted a reality their training had never prepared them for. Courage, discipline, and fighting spirit were irrelevant against systematic coordination, industrial logistics, and overwhelming firepower. Captain Nakamura, one of the few survivors from Ichiki's original detachment, recorded his reflections during evacuation. We believed individual warrior spirit could overcome material advantage. We were wrong. The Americans fought not as warriors but as engineers, calculating fields of fire, coordinating weapon systems, treating battle as a mathematical problem. Every attack we launched, they had anticipated. Every tactic we employed, they had countered with prepared positions and interlocking fire. We died bravely and accomplished nothing. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. Modern industrial warfare favored systems over heroics, logistics over courage, coordination over individual excellence. Japan's warrior ethos, perfected over centuries and validated through victories across Asia, had proven catastrophically obsolete against an enemy that approached war as an engineering challenge requiring industrial solutions. Guadalcanal didn't just cost Japan an island, it shattered the doctrinal foundations upon which the entire imperial military had been built. Guadalcanal established the template for every subsequent Pacific campaign and exposed the fundamental asymmetry that would determine the war's outcome. Japanese military doctrine, forged through centuries of samurai tradition and validated by swift victories across Asia since 1937, emphasized seishin, fighting spirit, as the decisive factor in combat. Officers taught that courage, discipline, and willingness to die could overcome any material disadvantage. Night attacks, bayonet charges, and aggressive offensive tactics were designed to negate enemy firepower advantages through shock and close combat, where Japanese warriors excelled. Guadalcanal proved this doctrine catastrophically wrong. The Americans approached warfare not as a test of individual courage, but as an industrial problem requiring systematic solutions. Machine guns positioned with mathematical precision, creating interlocking fields of fire. Artillery coordinated through forward observers and field telephones. Air support integrated with ground operations. Naval guns providing fire support from beyond visual range. Logistics systems ensuring troops remained fed, armed, and medically supported, regardless of battlefield conditions. Every Japanese attack, Tenaru, Bloody Ridge, the November offensives, followed the same pattern. Courageous soldiers charging into killing zones where survival was statistically impossible. Courage didn't fail. The entire conceptual framework of warfare had shifted beneath Japanese feet. The strategic implications extended far beyond one island. Guadalcanal demonstrated that America's industrial capacity could project overwhelming power across 5,000 miles of ocean and sustain combat operations indefinitely. Japanese forces, operating at the end of tenuous supply lines, couldn't match the systematic logistics that kept American forces combat effective. Post-war analysis by Japanese officers revealed the psychological impact. Major Tadashi Sumiyoshi wrote, "We believed we were fighting Americans. We discovered we were fighting American industry. Every weapon system, every logistical capability, every coordination procedure reflected a nation that had transformed war into an engineering discipline. Our courage was irrelevant. Modern industrialized warfare had arrived in the Pacific. Japan had brought swords to a gunfight and learned, through 25,000 deaths on one jungle island, that systems defeat spirit every time."